Here we're going to be layering and making the quilt sandwich. So first of all, I've got my backing fabric and I'm putting that right sides down. And I have some sawhorses set up, and then it's just I think 2 smaller pieces of the 1.5 inch foam insulation board from like Home Depot, and I've just taped it together so that it can kind of make like a hinge where I fold it flat, as you see here, and then it's usually big enough to do most of the quilts that, or the sizes that I'm making of the quilt. So I'm just kind of pinning that in place. The pins just go right through that board and getting all the wrinkles out. And then now I've got my batting and I'm just going to layer that on top, spread it out. Again, just kind of make sure all the wrinkles are out. And it's a nice pretty day, but you can see the wind's blowing, so a little bit of extra work there, but that's all right. Okay, and then the last thing to do is add the quilt top. And so I'm just spreading that out and kind of centering it so that I have enough fabric all the way around to kind of make like a handle and place that I can hang on to when I am doing the machine quilting on it. So just kind of centered it over the batting and backing, and then I'm just smoothing it all out here. Okay, and then I've got some round PVC poles, and I've just rolled the quilt top onto one, the batting onto the other, and then I'm using a 505 temporary spray adhesive, and I'm just spraying the backing fabric, and then I'll unroll the batting and kind of flatten it out, spread it out, make sure that it's adhered to all the glue. And then again, I'm just spraying. Now I'm spraying on the batting, unrolling the quilt top, smoothing and pressing as I go to kind of stick that in place. And then I kind of spray it in like 12-inch sections or so. Makes it a little bit easier to get it nice and flat, wrinkles out, and stuck down. So I'm just trimming off that extra batting that's kind of blowing around there. I don't need that on the quilt, so we'll just trim that off. And then I'm now rolling the quilt top and the batting to the halfway point. So I did half the first time and now I'm doing half this time. And then spraying again the 505 adhesive to the backing fabric, and then I'll unroll that batting and flatten it out, make sure it's nice and smooth. And then we'll add a layer of spray to the batting and then unroll the quilt top and flatten that out as well. And lots of smoothing, and this way everything's kind of glued into place and it makes the quilting a lot easier. You don't have to worry about things shifting. So I kind of got everything exactly where I want it there and pressed down. And then I'll just go ahead and remove all the pins from the backing fabric, and then we can fold up that quilt top. And then the next thing I do is I go ahead and I iron it to make sure that the glue is all stuck together.
Once we have the quilt all layered together with our piece top, the batting, and the backing, it's all glued into place. We use some spray adhesive to put it where it needs to be, and hopefully it will just stay there. So now what I'm going to do is just take my iron and just give it a good all over press. And this will kind of just help that glue kind of activate and make sure it's sticking to all the parts that we want it to stick to. And so I'm kind of just working from the center out. And it was pretty flat when I layered it, thanks to the help of really starched fabrics. That makes a huge difference when you're layering the quilts. But since it was nice and flat, it really went together well. It layered nicely. It doesn't have a lot of like poofy places where it didn't stick or has any problems laying down. And I'm just pressing up to the edge. I don't want to put my iron on the batting that has glue on it, just because that will make a mess on your iron. And having this cordless iron definitely helps also in doing this. So I do have it pretty hot. I think I have it on the highest heat setting. And again, I'm just kind of going center out and just making sure that I've got heat in all the places on the quilt, especially on the seams, so that they're glued nicely into place. We definitely want them to stay and not flip or anything when we're doing our quilting on it. And then the edges I'm going to try to get really good too, because I don't want them to pop up when I'm quilting. And I'll probably go back through and put a little safety pin every so often on the edges, just so that it doesn't shift. In case that it did happen to come unglued in some places, it won't really shift too much on me. Okay, and so I'm just going to keep working all the way around the quilt. Kind of center out and just making sure that it's getting the heat to activate that glue. Okay, a few things that we need to do before we start our machine quilting. I have gone ahead and oiled the machine and have it ready to go. I need to thread it yet, but I wanted to show you. I picked this light gray thread since I have light gray on the backing and along the outer triangles of the quilt. It's going to blend together with everything in there, and then that way I'm going to do my bobbin the same. So I have pre-wound several bobbins to get started, and it's much easier to do it now than when you're in the middle of the quilt and when you run out. And then so it's nice just to have a few ready to go. So I'm going to thread that, and then let's clip those. Okay, another thing that I sometimes do is I will take a dryer sheet, a new one, and just kind of wipe it over the machine bed. And that kind of helps to eliminate any of the static electricity that's going to like make my quilt top cling to my machine instead of moving freely. So that is just something I do. And then the other thing is I'm going to put on this sticky mat, and it just kind of adheres to the bed, the table that I have here on my sewing machine. And okay, looks good. And then here's the bobbins that I have pre-wound ready to go. And then I am using a chrome 9014 top stitch needle. And I do have a new one in there. I just replaced it, so it is ready to go. So let's go ahead and start our quilting. To get started, I'm just going to pull the quilt through the bed and arm of my machine here, and I'm kind of rolling up this end, this side, towards the center, because my first set of stitching is going to be right down the middle. And I'm going to just do some wavy lines. This one's going to be a really exaggerated wavy line down through the center of each of the cornerstones. And then on both sides of it, I'm going to do a little bit tighter curvy line, and then we'll just space those out. But to kind of get started and to hold it in place, I am going to start in the middle, roll this up, and I've got this other side here clamped up on this rack with some bungee cords and clamps. Okay, I think we got it kind of maneuvered here. And take this pin out. All right, so to get started, I am going to, right on the edge of the quilt where it meets the batting, I'm going to go ahead and needle up, needle down, and I am in the top part of the quilt. And the reason I do that is start right there is that when I go to put my binding off, or trim the quilt so that the batting and backing, when I trim that off, I do not want to snip any of my starting points on my thread, just so that later down the road, as the quilt gets used and laundered, we don't want any of those stitches to start coming out. So I do a really good back tack right in the very edge of the quilt top, because I know the binding will cover it when I put that on there. But then I'm gonna make sure that my top and bottom thread are both at the very top, and I kind of just did a locking stitch. I do have a walking foot on, and now I did not mark this, but what I'm going to do is just go down the center of the cornerstones. And so I'm kind of just giving myself a visual here. I can see the center point using the blocks to help line me up. And I'm just going to do the area within my hands and then readjust. So it is also helpful to have some gloves. So I'm going to put some of those on. And then we'll go ahead and do some quilting. And then I just readjust as needed. Just take your time. Okay, and when I've done a few stitches, and I can peek to the back here just to make sure everything looks good, I kind of want to check my tension on the back and the front and all my stitches. Everything looks good. So we're going to keep going. And this is, again, an exaggerated wavy line, so I'm not super concerned about being exactly in the center and keeping it exactly straight. Because my line isn't totally straight, it's very forgiving on the quilt design. And then as I'm stitching, I'm just going to kind of slide the quilt along this bar that I have. And then this part is just going to go up onto that table. And it just kind of supports itself and will move on its own. Okay, and I'm getting close to the end, and I did put a few pins in, so I'm going to take those out as I come to them. And then the same place at the right before I get onto the batting, so at the very edge of my quilt top, I'm going to do a couple stitches in place just to lock that thread nicely in place. Okay, and then I'm going to pull that out and clip my top thread and bobbin thread. Okay, and then kind of take a peek at it. Looks good. And so now I'm going to kind of unroll the quilt and work back, and I'm going to find another center of the blocks. And so these are about 11 inches apart approximately. And what that's going to help me do is to get everything stabilized in the quilting. I'm doing bigger sections to make sure everything's just held into place so that my backing doesn't start coming off of the quilt, or I get any bunching up of that backing fabric. So I'm going to do like some kind of initial quilting lines far apart just to hold everything in place, and then I'll come back through and work on the other lines to fill in that area. So I just kind of smooth it out, pull it back through, and I'm just accordion folding it in my lap. And I'm going to go ahead and take this pin out, and then we'll pull our bottom thread up and start our next row. I have now finished all of the long wavy lines that are going through the cornerstones throughout the quilt. So that put them approximately, 11 inches apart or so. And then now I'm going to go back and divide up those spaces between the lines that I already have. And I always do one close to the edge over here to help hold down that fabric. I don't want that to shift or move, and then that will be helpful when I put the binding on as well. It's already kind of tacked in place. So I kind of divided up this area, and I decided that I wanted to do 3 sections to have 3 spaces. So that would be 2 lines between each section, and evenly spacing them, they are approximately 3.5 inches apart. So what I have done is taken and put on the bar that goes onto the walking foot, the guide bar, and I spaced that 3.5 inches from the center of the needle to the end of the bar. And what I'll do with that guide bar then is just go down the center of the wavy line. So I'm not going to necessarily follow exactly on the wavy line, but just keep it so that it's going to be parallel to the line here. And so that I'm going to do 2 lines in each of these larger sections, and that will divide it into 3 spaces. The batting that I'm using suggests quilting no more than 3 inches apart, so that's going to be the largest chunk of space that I want to keep open with no quilting. So I am going to come back on each side of these, so then it will be less than 3 inches apart on my spaces. So that's ideal for this type of batting, especially if I'm going to launder the quilt, that type of thing. So let's go ahead and get going on those larger lines. And I'm going to start kind of on the very edge of the quilt, pull up my bobbin, and just do a few little tack down stitches to kind of hold that in place. And then I'm just going to follow this bar down the center of this. I'm mainly looking over here where my guide bar is, but then occasionally glance back just to make sure I'm not having any puckers or wrinkles or anything of that nature. So, okay. I have all the single lines done about every 3.5 inches apart. And now I'm going to go back and on both sides of that long, narrow squiggle line, I am adding a little bit of a tighter squiggle. And it's just a serpentine stitch on my machine, so it is a decorative stitch. And you can, check your machine. Sometimes you can elongate them or change the stitch length to make them a little different. You just don't want your stitch length to be so large that, you can easily pick it out or snag it, that kind of thing. So, or you can just move your, as you're quilting, just move it back and forth and it makes a fun little line. So what I've kind of done here is hopefully you can see the echoing, and in this darker navy it shows up, that gray thread shows up a little bit better. And then, so it kind of makes my uneven or my unquilted area less than that 3 inches. So then I know that my batting is not going to come apart or do anything after it's laundered or used. So so you can kind of see that I went on both sides of that line, and then I'll just proceed through the rest of the quilt. Here's my single line, so I'll just come back and I'm just kind of putting my presser foot right next to the side of the line, and it is making a squiggle, so I don't have to be super concerned about it being straight. It's just you just want it to be parallel to the line that you have in the middle of it. So it's just a fun effect. And then once we get those all done, then I'll go back through and just do a single line going horizontally, and that just kind of makes a neat, unique quilted design. I'm at the part where I can go ahead and put some more of the quilt up into the clamps, and that will just give me more room here without the pull of the quilt as I'm quilting it. And so I'm just going to grab a little bit of the quilt and just go ahead and reclamp it right in with the clamp. And I have 4 clamps, so I just kind of divide the length of it into 4 equal parts. That's kind of just draped up in there. And the last one. Okay, and then I'm ready to go on with my next line of quilting. All of the horizontal lines are done, actually the vertical lines, because I've turned it. So now I'm working on the horizontal that will go across the quilt. And on those, I'm just doing one of the smaller squiggle every 2.5 inches. So I kind of went through first and went through all of the cornerstone pieces and did that on each one, and then broke those sections then into lines that are 2.5 inches apart. So again, I just put the guide on the walking foot to do the measuring, so I haven't really marked anything. on the quilting for this. So that makes it kind of nice, and you can kind of see some of the pattern that it creates. Then it kind of creates a grid that just has some different lines of interest in there. So let's go ahead, and I've got a couple more areas to finish, and then we'll move on to the binding. All the quilting is completed, so now I'm going to go ahead and trim off the backing and batting, and I'm going to make sure that my thread tails, when I was quilting, where I started, I just left the longer bobbin and top thread pieces, so I'm just going to make sure those are off into my batting, so when I trim it off with my rotary cutter, I'm also getting rid of all those strings. So let's go ahead. And I'm just trimming right next to the edge, just like that. So then on my piece of fabric here, or the batting, and the fabric comes off just like that. Okay, I'm ready to join my binding strips, and what I'm going to do first is just lay them flat and fold them over fold them back on itself so that there is a 1/4 inch gap between the two strips, and then I am going to really iron that and press that good so that I get a crease in there. I want that crease to be visible. Okay. And then I'm going to gather up the quilt and put a clip on it because I want more space for these to move freely when I'm going to sew them together. So then I'm going to open this up, and then I can see my crease lines there. And I'm going to lay this one back on top of it and line up my crease lines in both directions. And it's kind of hard to see that. Okay, looks good. Okay. And just making sure that the lines are still kind of meeting up. All right, looks good. And then I'm going to take a pin. I'm going to pin towards the top and then this down here. And what I'm going to actually sew is from this point over to here. That's what I'm sewing. And then this just helps keep the tails freely moving so that they can fit underneath the sewing machine. Okay, and I've got that underneath my needle and presser foot here, right? I'm going to start right on that join. And then we're going to stitch right down to this intersection. Okay. Clip those threads. Okay, that has been stitched, that join there, and let's remove these pins and kind of give it a little test to make sure that it actually stitched together the way that we wanted it to. And it did, and it looks good. So then we can just pop it back open, and then I'm going to trim these ends off and just leave, you know, a 1/4 inch from that seam allowance. Okay. And just kind of give that a little press like that. And then I can remove this clip here. And then when I straighten it all out, it's going to fit really nicely in there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and stitch that down. Okay, I'm coming up on my corner here, and how I do the miter is I'm going to stop about 2 inches away from the corner itself and fold up this side first and go all the way over into that corner, and then fold this back. And now I do like to use a stiletto to kind of pull it a little bit and get it in place, and then kind of hold that right where I want it, right there in the corner. And then I will stitch down to that. And I'm going to stop right on that fold. And then I am going to pivot, and I like to do about 2 or 3 stitches to come down into that fold to just make sure that it's securely in place. And then I'll rotate it again so that I can come straight off this other way. And make sure that it got caught and looks good. And then I'll just continue. I just pull over the binding, and I'm stitching right along that edge. It's really, really close to the fold there. And I'll just do that all the way around the quilt.